Hello, in this series of videos we're going to be looking at Japanese Christianity to today. So when we last left off, we talked about how the Japanese government had brutally sought to suppress Christianity, had set up kind of a Buddhist inquisition or to find and execute any Catholics who were still around, how the Catholic Church would go underground and try and hide their identity in order to continue their community. And I ended with, I believe, with this image, and this is a contemporary Japanese Catholic artist who drew these paintings kind of remembering these events. Of course, she didn't live through them, but there's this kind of community memory of this. And you can see here, on the right, there's a woman who's been imprisoned, a Japanese Catholic, and on the left is a priest, a Western priest, hearing confessions at the seaside. So that's what's going to happen, right? There's going to the Catholic community will survive, but in this kind of complex form where they have to hide their Christian identity, which really you're not supposed to do, right? If someone asks, "Are you a Christian?" Or ask you to deny Christ, if you're a Christian, you're supposed to say, "No, I will not deny Christ." And then you're supposed to be willing to die a martyr. At least that's how Catholic theology works. So this community is in kind of a difficult spot. But in any case, they want to survive, so they hide their identity. And one reason they also kind of develop in this curious direction is that Japan is a closed country. It's not possible for the Spanish or Portuguese or most other European countries to enter into Japan, which means that the Catholic community will essentially be cut off from the priesthood. Right? It's very hard to be Catholic without priests because that's who hears confession, that's who performs the Eucharist, and all that kind of thing. So this is going to be a problem for them. The one group that is allowed to come into, the one European group that's allowed into Japan are the Dutch, because they promise not to undertake missionary work. And even they are kept on an island. And you see, if you look down at the bottom of this image, there's a island there with a castle around it. And that's Dejima, where the Dutch had to stay. And they were only allowed off the island like once or twice a year in order to engage in trade. And basically the Japanese government did that in order they could know what the Europeans were doing and keep them at arm's length. Now, to kind of continue then, to talk about new information, what's going to change the situation is the coming of the United States. Commodore Matthew Perry is going to come to Japan and say to the Japanese government, you need to open up to trade, and you need to protect any shipwrecked Americans who end up on your territory. If you do not agree to these things, I'm going to burn down your capital. He doesn't use those words exactly, but that's the threat, is that, we have overwhelming military force. We will use it if you don't do what we say, if you don't open the country. And that's Commodore Matthew Perry on the left, and that is a Japanese impression of what his ships look like, the so-called black ships. They were steamships. They put out all this smoke, and they were terrifying to many Japanese people. And the key thing is, even though this is kind of this drawing is, it's kind of an idealized or horrifying version, the fact was these ships were much more powerful. And this is how 17th century Europe and the West is different from the 19th century. The level of power is much more in favor of Europeans and the United States in the 19th century. They're just much more powerful. And so they're able to force Japan to open. And this will lead to the signing of this thing called the Harris Treaty eventually in 1858. And it does a lot of different things. But the key point, what it does that we need to focus on, is it allows for the permanent residence of Western diplomats. Okay, so it allows for Western diplomats to come in and live there. And it also allows for them in the territory where they live to establish churches for their own use. All right, so that's very important. So now you have legalized Christianity in certain places in Japan for certain people. It's not for Japanese people. It's not everywhere. But the idea here is that you now have a right for people to practice Christianity in Japan. Not Japanese people, Western people, but they're going to have churches, they're going to have people. And of course, very quickly, just as what we saw in Korea, they're going to secretly try and spread Christianity. So once the Christians are able to legally have residents in Japan, they're going to try and spread their faith. And one thing that happens that's fascinating to me is that there are a group of these hidden Christians who are near a French diplomatic outpost and a French church. And this is very important. So the United States is the first one to sign the treaty, but Japan will sign treaties with other countries later that also give this right to build churches for the use of foreigners. And what happens is there's this priest there, Father Bernard Petitjean, and he is at his church, and he knew the story that there had once been a thriving Catholic community, and he wondered if any of it was left. And all of a sudden one day, a bunch of Japanese ladies show up at his church, and they ask him several questions. They say, "Are you married?" And he says, "No." And they say, "Do you follow the Papa Sama in Rome?" Sama is you may have heard Japanese san is sometimes put after a name. It means like Mr. or Miss. Sama is like a high respected form. So for example, the word in Japanese for God is kami. And kami-sama is what Christians call God. So they said, is the Papa Sama, meaning the respected Pope, do you follow him? And he said, yes. And they said, please show us the statue of Maria Sama. And he did. And then they said, our heart is the same as yours. We're also Catholics. Right. So, of course, Father Bernard Petitjean was so ecstatic that this community of hidden Christians had come out and found him. Now, I want to say really quickly, we're not going to go into it. Not all hidden Christians would come back to the Catholic Church. Some would continue to practice their own form of Christianity in secret. This seems it had departed too much from Catholic Christianity. It didn't seem like the same religion anymore. But this group of women and then the men and the children of their village that they had come from, they wanted to come back and reform this Catholic community. And and this happened in 1865, and unfortunately this led to renewed persecution. The Japanese government, it didn't go around and execute them, but what it did do was it forced them to go into exile. It moved them away from the foreigners, this often included the loss of a lot of their property. They were moved to places that were not nice to live in and that weren't set up for them. So this killed a lot of these Catholics who revealed themselves. And Japan was heavily criticized for this by Western countries, right? These people, from the West perspective, seem perfectly harmless. That's not how the Japanese government saw it, and this led to a lot of criticism. Now, again, this isn't a class on the development of the Japanese government, but there's something important I have to talk about here to understand how the treatment of Christianity is going to change. So in 1868, we have what's called the Meiji Restoration, and this kicks out the old samurai government and restores the emperor to power. Now, it gets really complex because it's a big question about how much power the emperor actually wielded. But what I want to emphasize here is look at the emperor, right? He almost looks like a Westerner in that picture, right? If I hadn't told you that this was about Japan, you would maybe even think that he was a Western person. But he is the Meiji Emperor. He's the Japanese emperor. And I use this image to show that this new government was very interested in modernization. It was very interested in undertaking radical reform in order to make Japan into a strong state. Right? They saw all this imperialism of Western countries. They saw how powerful Western countries were, right? In the 1600s, they were able to kick out the Europeans, no problem. But in the 19th century, the Americans show up with a few ships, and they have to just do what the Americans say. And they say, we need to become powerful or we're going to get taken over like all these other countries, like our neighbor Vietnam. They got taken over by the French. This is a problem. India's been taken over by the British. We don't want that to happen to us. We need to build a strong country. We need to undertake radical reform. And the people who restore the emperor to power, who put forward this modernizing government, they have this thing called the Charter Oath. And that's the Charter Oath there, even though you can't read Japanese, or some of you maybe can. You can see it's very short. And one of them says, we will go, it's actually this one. This means world. We will go out to the world to seek wisdom. Right? We're going to learn from the outside world. So there's this idea among the Japanese, the Westerners are really powerful. If we're going to beat them and stay independent, we need to learn about them and get that advanced technology that they have. And if that takes radical reform, that's what we'll do. As part of this, they send this thing out called the Iwakura Mission. And its goal is to go out into the United States and Europe and try and revise some of the treaties that Japan had been forced to sign. These were unequal treaties that gave foreigners in Japan a lot of advantages, but it kind of weakened Japan. That was their main goal. The Western governments, though, at this point are not willing to revise those treaties, so it more becomes like a fact-finding mission where the goal is to learn about what's going on in Western countries, and so that the Japan can become powerful itself. Right, so it's going to transform from this kind of mission seeking to revise the treaties into one that's trying to figure out how do we make Japan strong by learning from the West. And you may say, what happened to the Christianity? I thought this was a class on Christianity. Well, here it comes, because the Iwakura mission has a lot to say about Christianity. So here is one of the statements about Christianity. It would not be wrong to regard tales about voices from heaven and criminals raised from the dead as similar to the delirious ravings of madness. So they're talking about, the gospel seem really weird to us. They hold that someone crucified was the Son of the Heavenly Lord, and they kneel reverently wailing in lamentation. In all European and American cities, pictures of crucified criminals, profuse with ruby red blood, are hung everywhere on building walls and rooms, making one feel as though one is living in a cemetery or staying in an execution ground. If this is not bizarre, then what is? So for these Japanese officials, the public practice of Christianity and Christian teachings about the resurrection sound really crazy. They're like, why do you think that that God would be crucified? Why do you want to have pictures of him everywhere? Why are you worshiping this criminal? Why are you emphasizing he's a criminal? This seems really weird to us. But here's the thing. These were, we might disagree with this, right? You might disagree with this. But here's the thing. There's some insightful things here. In the teachings of Christ, there is much that is bizarre. However, when it comes to earnestness of practice, we must blush with shame. Everyone from kings and princes to servants and small children understand what is said in this one book, the Bible. High and low alike carry it to the temple, the church, on the weekly day, Sunday, returning home after hearing sermons and carrying out their worship. Even though the level of discourse is not elevated, they are fervent. What we should respect in a religion is not its argument, but its practice. So this is really striking. So one thing we have to emphasize, what's going on here, is that these Japanese who visit Europe and the West and the United States are just kind of like, this Christianity thing's really weird. But it's a unifying force. It's something that brings people together. And remember, Japan had just gone, the Meiji Restoration was a civil war. So the Japanese, they're looking at their country and say, we're really divided. We just had a civil war. We're nervous about the Westerners taking us over. You know what? Western people use religion to unify themselves. We need to use religion to do the same thing, right? We need to use religion to do the same thing. Also, these Western people seem really, really serious about Christianity. So maybe we need to back off a little bit there, while at the same time trying to find some way to use religion to unify our people. So this will lead to several things. For one thing, there will be the removal of anti-Christian signboards and prohibitions on Christian funerals. In basically what happened at Crossroads, there would be a sign like this one that says, if you know of a Christian or a Christian priest and you inform on them, the government will give you this much money. So those were taken down. There had been laws against Christian funerals. Remember, that's one way that the Buddhist Inquisition worked. Because Buddhists practiced cremation, Christians did not. So to make sure you weren't a Christian, they would want to cremate you after you died. So they kind of are saying, we're not going to go after Christianity in particular, but Christianity is not legalized for Japanese people. There's no legal protection for Christians. So they put Christianity in this really weird spot, but the basic idea is they say, you know what, the Western people are serious about this stuff. We're not going to try and persecute Christians. That's going to cause problems with the West. And one reason also they want to make it easier for Christians to exist in Japan was that many people who were willing to come to Japan to teach and share modern Western knowledge were Christians. So for example, this man, William Clark, who was an American educator and very devout Christian, is going to be instrumental in the development of something called Sapporo Agricultural College. And this is in Hokkaido, the very far north of Japan. And he's going to go there to teach modern American farming techniques. So this is kind of the trade-off. Japan is saying, you know what? The West is serious about Christianity. We're being criticized because of our poor treatment of Christians. We want to have good relations with the West because we don't want them to invade us, and we want them to help us learn Western knowledge so we can become a powerful country. So let's just kind of tolerate Christianity. Let's let Christians come here and work. And that's what's going to happen. So this guy, William Clark, going to come help develop this Sapporo Agricultural College. And what ends up happening is he converts like his whole first class to Christianity. And they become known as the Sapporo Band. And this doesn't mean like band like they're musicians. It means band like a group of people. And what I think is really striking, though, is they then form the Sapporo Independent Church. You might say the word's kind of tricky to use. It means a lot of different things, different people. But you could almost say that this is a non-denominational church. And that's very important. We'll come back to that more later. But you now have the development of Protestant Christianity. In this lecture, we talked a lot about Catholics. In other lectures, we're going to focus on Protestants here with a little bit about Catholics. But they're going to form their own Protestant church. So now we actually have Protestant communities in Japan. But there's a sense that they see themselves as different from the missionaries, right? This is the Sapporo Independent Church. So in one sense, there's this influence coming in from the West, but there's also this Japanese sense of let's do our own thing with Christianity. I think one person who illustrates that very well is a man named Uchimura Kanzo. Uchimura Kanzo was a samurai descendant who was interested in learning English. And he was part of the second class at Sapporo Medical College. So he didn't actually meet William Clark, but his classmates would convince him to convert to Christianity. And he said in his life, and he used English to say this, that there were two J's in his life, Jesus and Japan. So he's someone who was a very devout Christian, who was also very, very loyal to Japan. And you'll see this very strongly among the Japanese Christians. He will study, though, in the United States, and he has a complex relationship with the United States. He admired a lot of its industrial power and economic development, was very upset at the sheer amount of racism that he saw, and this allowed him then to take kind of a critical view. He didn't worship the West. He saw the West as something that had some good things to offer Japan, but also some problems. And the idea was, let's get the good things without the problems. It's interesting. He was heavily influenced by the Quakers and would mostly embrace their ideas of pacifism. And I think I should also note one thing about Quakers historically is their tendency to not be too fond of ritual, right? Quakers, for example, in a traditional Quaker meeting, you would assemble on Sunday and everyone would sit together and they would sit quietly until someone felt that the Spirit moved them and they would get up to speak. And there was not really a set, there's not like a set of readings. There's not like a Lord's, like a mass where you have all these call and response prayers. It was this idea that the Spirit would talk through people. And it was possible that the Spirit might not talk through anyone that Sunday, right? You could go and sit for an hour in complete silence and no one feels that the Spirit is calling on them to speak. So it's a religion, or I should say an understanding of Christianity that emphasizes, de-emphasizes ritual, emphasizes the Holy Spirit working in our hearts. And it was also one that emphasized pacifism. And Uchimura Kanzo became very, very frustrated with mission churches. What would happen is you'd have these different Protestant churches come and establish missions in Japan, and they would compete with each other and disagree with each other, use in terms of issues that maybe made sense in the United States, but don't make sense in Japan. And I think as an example, if I recall correctly, Uchimura Kanzo said, you know, if the Western Cumberland, Kentucky church comes to Japan to share the gospel, that's great, but we don't need everything that goes into Western Cumberland, Kentucky church, right? That church is an American church that was formed around American issues. The mission churches are just trying to expand their churches here instead of allowing the Japanese to develop our own understanding of Christianity. And, you know, basically what the Western people are trying to do is try and make their concerns universal to all Christians when maybe they only apply in the United States and not to Japan. So he had this frustration. He also thought that the mission church missionaries often did not take their Japanese converts seriously. And one thing about Uchimura Kanzo was he was someone who very much treasured his independence. So he's very frustrated with mission churches. And he goes, and I think you combine these two things, his interest in the Quakers, his frustration with mission churches, and you get someone who would see churches and sacraments as a hindrance to salvation, which is really striking, very different from other forms of Christianity, which sees the church as necessary. Sacraments is very important, and even if they may not call it sacraments, for example, if you're a Baptist, you're not going to call things sacraments, but you usually think that baptism is really important. And he's like, nope, those things, far from helping us get salvation, they actually are a hindrance to salvation. So it's interesting, then you think about, well, if you become a Christian, what do you do if you don't go to a church and you don't have sacraments? Like, what do you do? And so what Uchimura Kanzo does is he tends to focus on lectures and the publications of journals. And this leads to the development of what is called the Mukyokai, or the non-church movement, which is going to focus a lot on lectures. And I think it's really striking. And some people kind of joke it's a non-church church. But the key thing was it was basically a place where people got together to talk about Christianity and how to be a good Christian. So it was kind of like making church into like a classroom. And it's interesting because this is the one form of religion in Japan that actually had more men than women. Usually women in Japanese religion make up the majority of participants. Here, it seems like it was this kind of, it attracted basically this small group of intellectual men. But even though, and this is what's tricky, even though there weren't that many people who might consider themselves members of Mukyokai, there were a lot of people who liked to listen to the lectures and read the publications. So this Uchimura Kanzo, through this, had a huge influence. And he became known as a teacher, a journalist, an author, and there's a book about him called Japan's Modern Prophet. So he became this very important Christian intellectual. And I want to show you this is his gravestone, and there it is, his name at the top, and then it says in English, I for Japan, Japan for the world for Christ, and all for God. And I think that's his own handwriting. So that's Uchimura Kanzo's tombstone.